Chapter 5 is covering the integumentary system, which is the first system that we're going to cover in AMP1. When we're talking about the integumentary system, what we really care about is we're going to end this chapter with kind of some how it could go wrong when we're talking about such as burns. So we're going to first learn about what it should be, why it should be what it is, and then we're going to actually talk about some pathophysiology type things. So it's a lot of fun to start now diving into not just what systems are and what part of AM and how everything relates together, but start kind of finding where it can go wrong. So as we talk about these systems, we'll start embedding these and some disorders into the course as we go. So when we're talking about the integumentary system, this is the official name for the skin. So the integumentary system will cover all of these areas. We are going to primarily focus on skin, and we're going to briefly touch on sweat glands and sebaceous glands. For this course, I will not be diving in deep into hair and nails. So this chapter, chapter 5, is one of the shorter chapters, but it's also one of the ones we're going to spend the least amount of of time and focus on. So it's kind of an easier chapter in the world of AMP. So we're going to start with section 5.1, talking about the structure of the skin. So when we are actually talking about the skin, we are talking about something that is covering the entire surface area of the body. So this is a covering. So it is a vast amount of space that we are going to be talking about. It weighs about 4 to 5 kilograms, which is about 9 to 11 pounds. As it covers our entire surface area, it actually accounts, it's about 7% of our total body weight. So this is a large part of what makes us who we are, is going to be this integumentary system. So as we go, the overall structure, what makes it unique? There are going to be two distinct regions to the skin, and we will break these down and talk about each one individually. The first region is going to be the epidermis, and the epidermis is going to be the most superficial, so it is going to be the most external. So this is the one that is actually between the outside environment and your internal body. It's going to be the sheath. When you see the term epi, anytime you see that, will actually mean upon. That's the root of that. So kind of gives you an idea that this is the skin that's upon. So the next region is going to be the dermis. And this region will be underneath the epidermis, so it'll be essentially below. And it will contain a lot of other types of tissue. It will contain fibrous connective tissue, and this is going to be vascular. So we're going to talk about vascular, avascular a couple times. And then underneath both of these, there is going to be, it's not considered its own place, but it will be another kind of joining, which is going to be the hypodermis. And this hypodermis is going to be the connection between this dermal layer, which is consisting of our integumentary system, and then our underlying tissue, connective tissue, joints, muscle, nerve tissue, blood, all that. So this hypodermis is going to be kind of an in-between buffer. It's subcutaneous, which means it is below to the skin. And consists mainly, this is where you'll find your adipose tissue. So it falls into underneath your actual dermal layer. So hypodermis is underneath your dermal layer, but when we're talking about the two distinct regions, we are talking about these two. Okay, so when we're looking at the surface of the skin, this is kind of the cross section you will see. We're going to take the first part. It's going to be whenever you see this whole thing, we are talking about the epidermis. However, this is going to be just the dermis. You can see that right there. Where this falls into the dermis category. So just keep in mind the region we're talking about. So starting with 5.2, the epidermis. There are going to be different cell types that make up this epidermal layer. And each of these cell types is going to have a different instruction, a little bit of a different structure, and will reside in different layers within this epidermis. So we're going to talk about those. The majority, what you'll actually hear, is going to be this keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. So that's going to be the type of tissue that we're going to have, but these cell types will make up that type of tissue. So what are these cell types? The first one is going to be, like I said, there are 4. So let's just go ahead and give that. So the first one is the keratinocytes. The keratinocytes essentially are going to be the type of cell in your epidermal layer, and they are going to be primarily responsible for producing keratin. Keratin is a protein that essentially gives the skin its hard, connective, protective properties. So this keratin is really, really, really important. Keratinocytes, anytime you see the word cyte, remember it means cell. So this is a cell that produces keratin. So that's kind of how you can help remember it. This is the primary cell in your epidermis. This is what you're going to have the most of. And these are going to be tightly connected by desmosomes. So that means, thinking back to the previous chapters on how cells are connected to each other, go back and review what desmosomes look like. So this is our outside layer, remember our epidermis. So with this keratinocyte, we are talking about millions of these types of cells getting sloughed off every day. So we're essentially bumping up against things, rubbing up against things, having abrasions, having injuries, just walking down a hallway. All of these things are going to cause your external layer of your epidermis and those cells to be sloughed off. So that is what's happening with why we need why we need so many of these keratinocytes, and then what happens kind of to them. We essentially do lose them as we move about our day. Okay, the next type of cell we're going to have is our melanocytes. Our melanocytes, these are a spider-shaped epithelial cells, and what they are responsible for is they are actually going to synthesize a pigment. And they will synthesize the pigment that is actually going to be called melanin. So remember, it's a cyte, which means it's a cell, so they are producing melanin. These are going to be found in the deepest layer of the epidermis, I apologize. The deepest layer of the epidermis. So these are really important, but they're not going to be on the most surface level. They're going to be in the deepest layer of this dermis. And what is happening with this epidermis and what's happening with these melanocytes is they are actually, as they produce this pigment melanin, they will actually protect the cell from UV rays. So this is really, really, really cool. So these cells, if this is going to be our little cell right here, this is our melanocyte, and he's going to produce a pigment melanin. Melanin is actually a dark pigment. And so as it does this, it will actually form from the deepest layer. And as it will actually form melanin, it's called melanosomes. So after it produces this melanin pigment, it'll call these things called melanosomes, which are going to be membrane-bound granules of melanin. And so as these melanocytes form a membrane-bound granule that is going to be filled of melanin, these are going to be called melosomes. And what it will actually do, it will transfer this melosome to a keratinocyte. So now we're going to incorporate the other type of cell. And as it transfers this little membrane brown granule of melanin to another keratinocyte, as it does that, this is going to be kind of a nearby cell. What's going to be really cool about this is the melanin that is now going to be in your keratinocyte will actually accumulate on one side of the cell. And it will accumulate on what is called the sunny side of the cell. Basically what that means, remember this is our outside layer, so here's our skin, here is our sun. if we have cells right here, the sunny side is going to be the side that is closest to the sun. So what's actually going to happen is this melanin will accumulate on this sunny side. So it'll actually accumulate on the part of the cell that is closest to the sun. And as it does this, what it's actually going to do is it's going to form a shield. So this collection of this pigment will form a shield. And what it's actually doing is it is actually going to form the shield on top of the nucleus. And what it's doing is if it's protecting the nucleus from the sun, it's actually going to protect the DNA inside the cell, inside the nucleus, from the damaging effects of the UV rays. So that's a lot of really cool information of why we have these melanosomes that are moved from one cell to the other, that are passing along this melanin from a melanocyte to a keratinocyte. When the melanin gets into a keratinocyte, it will accumulate on what is called the sunny side of the cell. And it's actually, if this is going to be my nucleus, it will protect the nucleus by formulating on the side of the cell that is facing the sun. It's called the sunny side of the cell. And as it does this, it will actually create a barrier. It's a sun shield protecting the DNA from the damaging UV rays of the sun. So that is what's going on with our melanocytes, but you also need to know this process of melanin. That's very important. Okay, so that's a little bit about the second type of the cell. We're going to talk about two more. We've got the dendritic cells and then the tactile cells. So looking at these briefly, we're going to start with our dendritic cells. This type of cell is a star-shaped cell, and it will actually kind of arise from our bone marrow and become part of our epidermis. And what they are key responsible for on our skin is they're going to be an immune response. So these are going to act as kind of an immune defender on our skin. So that's our first round of immune protection, is going to be the dendritic cells on our skin. And then the fourth type of cell are going to be called tactile cells. You may also see this in some old editions or in other publications as a Merkel cell. That's the name for the guy who discovered it. But now science is moving into calling things based on what they actually do. So a tactile cell is actually going to be a sensory receptor. So this is picking up the sensations within the environment and then communicating them to the internal environment through the nervous system. So these are going to live all over your skin. This is how you can pick up the sensations of touch. Cold, hot, all of those types of pieces. We will revisit tactile cells towards the end of the chapter. Towards the end of the class when we get to the nervous system. But this is where you can find some of this sensory receptors. So these are the main four types of cells. The way they are organized is going to be very, very unique. So there are going to be very specific layers to this epidermis. So as we have these layers to our epidermis, there are 5 different types of layers. And these 5 different types of layers are going to be organized in a very specific manner. So you are technically going to have 5 distinct layers, so I want you guys to know that. But depending on which type of skin we're talking about, there's something called thick skin. Thick skin will have all 5, whereas thin skin will only contain 4. So there are 5 different types of layers, but depending on where you have thick and thin skin. So thick skin is found in places where you're going to be able to have more abrasion and rubbing off of your skin cells, like the palms of your hands and the bottom of your feet. Thin skin is only going to contain 4 layers and won't be really found in places of high abrasion. So maybe like the small of your back or your forearm. So it's going to be the distinct difference between 2 types of skin is really we're going to miss 1 layer, but we're going to talk about that when we get there. So these 4 layers, we're going to start and we're going to go through all 4 as you look at these, just to give you a frame of reference, it is kind of interesting the way they have it listed here. So when they have it listed here, this is going to be the most internal, so the deepest layer, and this is going to be the most external. So even though they have them numbered 1 through 5, we are starting with 1 at the bottom and 5 is going to be the top. So it's kind of inverted. Okay, so starting with layer 1, and this is to be your stratum basale. So your stratum basale is your base layer. That's what that means. It is going to be the deepest layer. So it is going to be the most internal layer of part of your epidermal layers. It is going to be so deep that it is actually going to be attached to the dermis on the bottom. So this is going to consist of one single row of cells. So it will consist of a single row of specifically keratinocytes. And what these keratinocytes are doing is they are going through a process of active mitosis. So they are going to be constantly going through cell division. They are constantly dividing. So if we are going to have, here's my sun, here's my epidermis, here's my dermis. What we're talking about is this bottom layer right here, which is going to be my stratum basale. And with this stratum basale, I'm going to have one lovely keratinocyte who then will divide into 2, because that's what mitosis does. It divides. As it goes through this constant mitosis of division, it's going to produce 2 daughter cells at one time. 1 daughter cell, 2 daughter cells. And what's going to happen is 1 daughter cell is going to stay on the actual stratum basale layer. So 1 daughter cell will stay in the stratum basale, and that's so it can rapidly divide and produce more cells. Whereas the other daughter cell will do something different, and it will actually move up through the layers. So here we go. We have 1 daughter cell that has stayed in stratum basale and 1 daughter cell that has moved up and will eventually move all the way through these 5 layers. So that's what's happening in the stratum basale. It's also called the stratum germinativum, because that's where you have this active mitosis happening. Anytime you see the word germ, it's essentially going to be initial stages, production, birth, growth, all of those phrases. So another thing that's happening in the stratum basale, it is mainly going to be made up of keratinocytes, because they are the ones who are doing the dividing. So the primary cell is going to be keratinocytes, but it will also include about 10 to 25% of the cells are going to be melanocytes. So this is where we're going to be producing that dark melanin pigment in order to protect the nucleus of the cells. So that's what's happening with stratum basale. The next layer is going to be the stratum spinuosum. Stratum essentially just means layer. So whenever you see stratum before something, it just means layer. So this is not going to be 1 cell layer thick. This is going to be several cell layers thick. And this is actually going to kind of be a web-like section of things that are going to be integrated together. It's kind of a prickly layer, this stratum spinosum. Keratinocytes are going to be found in this particular layer. There's a lot of keratinocytes, but they are actually going to have something called spines. And these spines are going to be kind of a prickly type of look. So it kind of looks like a medieval spiked iron ball. And these keratinocytes with these spines are essentially a pre-keratin filament. And essentially what that does is when after you will move up through the next couple of layers, that is going to become very, very important for some of those top layers. So we're going to start producing that kind of keratin filament in these particular cells. So you're going to have lots of keratinocytes here in this stratum spinosum, but you're going to, these are going to be the prickly. In this, they're going to be called prickle cells. But what you will also have in this cell layer is the other types of cells. So it will also include some melanosomes plus some immune response with some dendritic cells. So it's going to also include those. Okay, the third layer of the epidermis is your stratum granulosum. And this layer is going to be a couple cell layers thick, so it's about 4 to 6. These are super, super flat, so it's a thin layer. So we are going to have about 4 layers of cells, but they're all going to be very flat. So it's a thinner layer than you would think. So what's happening in this cell is that your cell will actually go through a process of changing. And so what's going to happen in this is you're going to do a couple different things. So in the stratum granulosum, it's very, very cool. It will go through the process of keratinization. And what's going to happen with keratinization that will be beginning in this particular layer is this will be the process of your cells beginning to fill with the keratin hard protein. So you're going to fill the cells from the inside out, fill it up with protein. As this happens, your cells will go from a round or a square shape to a flat shape. So this is where we get this flat pancake happening. What's also going to happen with this one is you are going to accumulate granules. And granules are going to be things that will accumulate inside the cell and underneath the microscope. They kind of look like specks of sand or marbles, but that's where stratum granulosum comes from. So what they're going to do is connect these granules is they're going to actually connect 2 types of granules. There will be a keratinohyaline granule. Keratinohyaline granule with an E. And this type of granule is essentially going to be the strength, or it's going to be the keratin in our top layers. So as we continue moving up these layers of the epidermis, this keratinohyaline granule will actually form keratin. So that's this guy right here. What will also accumulate is something called lamellar granules. And lamellar granules are going to be a little bit different. And what these are going to do is these are going to contain a water-resistant glycolipid. And if we have a water-resistant, so it doesn't like water, glycolipid, it's going to be kind of a sticky, sugary fat that will move into the extracellular space. So between all of these cells, we are now going to have something that doesn't like water, and it's going to be a sticky kind of lipid shape. So essentially what this does is we are now going to start creating a water-resistant barrier. And as we're creating this water-resistant barrier, if you think skin is waterproof, you don't actually have liquid come in through your skin. So that's what we're going to actually be doing. What's also cool about this is cells that are above this layer die. So this is where cell death will start to occur. And with this cell death, as we're going further up these layers, we're going to start having more and more cell death, because when we get to the most external layer, your cells will be considered dead. And that is why it's easy to get rid of them if we need to. So the next layer is going to be your stratum lucidum. This is layer 4. Your stratum lucidum. This is also the layer that is not going to always be there. So this will be the layer that is only present in thick skin. So your thin skin doesn't have this particular layer. Stratum lucidum is a very thin, translucent layer. It's only a couple cell layers or rows thick, the very clear, flat, dead skin cells. So it's essentially kind of looks like a clear layer. It's very, very small. And that's really what we're going to talk about it. So then the last layer is going to be the stratum corneum. And this layer is the most external layer. So stratum corneum. This is the most external, most superficial layer. It will actually consist of 20 to 30 rows of anucleated, keratinized skin cells. So what we mean by anucleated, there is no nucleus, because up here in this keratinization process in the stratum granulosum layer, you start to lose and kill off your nucleus. So it's an anucleated. These do not have the ability to divide. It is keratinized, so it's going to be full of this hard keratin protein that again happens in this keratinization process in the stratum granulosum. And they're considered dead cells. At this point, they do not have any criteria that qualifies them as living. They do not have access to blood. They do not have access to nerves. They do not have the ability to replicate. They do not have any normal metabolic functions happening inside them. They've essentially become a hard, just exterior wall with nothing on the inside. So this stratum corneum is going to be made up of a lot of these anucleated keratinized dead skin cells. So much so that this accounts for about 3/4 of the epidermal thickness. So this is the majority of your epidermis is going to be this particular kind. While this is interesting that these are keratinized dead skin cells, this is also really, really, really important because there's a couple functions why we need this type of a dead cell, but also keratinized type of cell. So the functions of the stratum granulosum in these particular cells is they are actually going to prevent water loss. They have become a impermeable water barrier, so it's essentially waterproof. So they are essentially, now your skin is waterproof, but with these cells and the glycolipids. It is actually going to be responsible for protection for deeper cells within the skin. So it's got just protection. And the primary reason is it's going to be a barrier. And this barrier is not just a barrier between the inside and the outside, but it is going to be a biological barrier. It's a physical barrier, and it's a chemical barrier. So it will have a couple different types of barrier mechanisms. It'll also be responsible for, with this protection and with this barrier, it's going to protect from abrasion. Specifically, so if you were to rub your hands against the desk and the desk surface, you're going to start losing skin cells. So as it does that, because there's lots of layers, remember this is about 20 to 30 rows of skin cells, if you take off the top layer because of abrasion, it doesn't matter, you have plenty left over. So even though these cells are dead, it's really important to know these functions of what is going on with these skin cells. Okay. So with this skin cell is you will actually go through a process where you will control your actual rate of growth, and this is going to be called apoptosis. So apoptosis is going to be programmed or controlled cell death. So there's a set time, a set way that your cells will actually cease to be able to use their function. So this is how we get dandruff and dander. And you can actually shed about 50,000 types of cells per minute. So it's about 40 pounds in your overall lifetime. That is a ton, and also not kind of disgusting. It is a true statement. This is where we are. So to give you an idea of your epidermis, just to kind of go through and describe these 5 layers. If this is our outside environment, so here's our sun, we're going to have 5 layers of our epidermis right here. And it's going to be from the bottom up, basally, and then it's going to be the layer of spinosum, and then it's going to be the layer of granulosum, and then it's going to be the layer of lucidum, and then it's going to be the layer corneum. So stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and stratum corneum. So this is going to be your epidermis. From the know this direction, this is going to be internal or deep, and this is going to be external. But what's next is going to be underneath this, and this is going to be our dermis. So this is the next region that we're going to talk about. So within our dermis, it's going to look a lot different than our epidermis. This is a strong, flexible, connective tissue. So that's important to remember. This is connective tissue. And it's going to contain a bunch of different types of cells. So these cells are going to be have lots of different functions. So whereas the epidermis had only 5 types of cells, your dermis is going to have a lot of different types of cells. Some of these examples are going to be fibroblasts, remember, which is the immature fibroid, or another way to say that is cartilage tissue, macrophages, which will destroy, and occasionally mast cells and white blood cells, which will impact your immune response. So remember, it's a connective tissue, so there's going to be a matrix, extracellular matrix, that is made up of fibers and ground substance. So it's going to have your ground substance and your fibers. So remember, that's what makes up a connective tissue. So these fibers are really going to bind this particular layer together. It will also contain nerves, blood vessels, and your lymphatic and your drainage system connections. So all of it, there's a lot going to be happening in your dermal layer. You'll also have your hair follicles, your sweat glands, your oil glands. All of those will be found in their connections to this. So there are only 2 layers to this. So your dermis will have 2 layers. This is our epidermis. So we're going to talk about this layer right here. This is our dermis. So the 2 layers to your dermis are going to be from the most, if this is our epidermis, I'm just going to go ahead and give us a list. Here's our dermis. The most superficial layer of our dermis is going to be our papillary layer. So your papillary layer is going to be this one. It is the most superficial layer of your dermis. It is going to be made up of areolar connective tissue. So there's going to be lots of fibers. So it's superficial and it's made up of connective, loose interlacing collagen, elastin fibers, and our blood vessels. So that's really, really, really important. But what's cool about this is this thing called the dermal papillae. So the dermal papillae essentially is how this is going to be connected to the dermis. So papillae is going to be little projections or little bumps, and it's going to be the connection between the dermis and the epidermis. So this is going to not be a straight line. So the one I drew up here, this is not the case. What is actually happening with the epidermis and the dermis is that these will connect with a corrugated cardboard pattern. So it will look like this on a larger scale. Papillae is going to be little mounds, finger-like projections. So you'll have your epidermis here, and then you'll have this finger-like projection of your dermis kind of sticking up. So it's a corrugated cardboard kind of manner. So if you look right here, you can actually see that corrugated cardboard manner right there. That's the connection between those two, where the dermis will stick up into the epidermal layer. This is where you will find capillaries. It's where you will find nerve endings, and it's where you'll find touch receptors. So what's also cool about this, if this is where you will find your blood, so as a reminder, your epidermis is avascular, whereas your dermal layer is not. So if I'm going to have my blood supply here, I'm going to have to travel and take this blood up through my epidermal layer. So this is where you will actually have the vascularization for the entire skin. So as we get further away from this layer, the first layer, the stratum basale, will have access to blood supply through this close proximity connection. As we get further away, that's actually why your cells will start to die, because they're going to be further away from that nutrients, further away from the oxygen, further away from everything that the blood is actually bringing to the dermal layer. So that's very interesting and kind of cool. What's also happening with these dermal papillae is that in thick skin, these will actually fall on what are called dermal ridges. And these dermal ridges, if this is my dermal ridge, so this is going to be my dermis and my epidermis, if you follow this pattern and you've got a wave at the bottom of the ocean, it will create a wave at the top. And this will be your epidermal ridges. And so what you happen with these epidural ridges is this is where you actually are going to see external ridges. And these are going to be called friction ridges because they're going to be on the external surface of your skin. What you know these as is when there is oil that collects in these epidermal ridges, oil or sweat, it will actually leave a unique fingerprint pattern. So these epidermal ridges, once you actually have sweat kind of accumulate, you will create your fingerprints. All of because you will have this dermal papillae deep in your integumentary system. So it's very, very cool. So you can kind of see how those work there. The second layer is going to be the reticular layer. So the reticular layer is going to be the deepest layer of the dermis. So it's the bottom layer of your dermal, but it's the thickest. So it will actually make up about 80% of your dermal thickness. So that's incredibly important. So not only is it deep, but it is going to be super, super thick. It is going to be made up of very dense, fibrous, connective tissue. So there's going to be a lot of fibers that are going to be made up of this particular layer. So there's a lot of elastin, there's going to be a lot of collagen. This is also where you're going to have some pockets of adipose cell. So if we're looking at this reticular layer, it is also going to have something that are going to be called cleavage lines. Cleavage or tension lines. This is going to be different than the dermal papillae leading to the friction ridges. So these are going to be tension or cleavage lines. This is going to be due to collagen fiber running in a specific direction. So your collagen fiber will all in a regular connective tissue run in the same direction, or if you have a dense irregular connective tissue, they run in different directions. But this is going to be collagen fibers running in the same direction, specifically parallel to the skin surface. So when you have a bunch of underlying fibers running parallel to the surface of the skin, what you can actually see is these, they are externally invisible, but if you were to slice perfectly right down these cleavage lines, you are going to have a very nice clean cut. Whereas if you were a surgeon and you were to cut more so in a pattern where here is our skin, here's our top layer. And if you didn't have your collagen fibers running parallel, but you had them running in all different directions underneath your skin, there is not a very clean way to cut through that without causing a lot of damage. So for surgeons, this is an externally invisible cleavage line, but they know that running deep to the surface of the skin in the reticular layer, the collagen fibers run in a nice clean line. That's what surgeons will actually cut through. So there's a plan to how they actually open up the body. So you can kind of see here with the cleavage lines, this is the directions that surgeons will follow when they are cutting open with whatever they need to, because they are following the collagen fiber. So it's really cool for that to be kind of something that is so well used, even though it is invisible to the naked eye. So that's what's going on with those. What you do have is visible lines that you can see. And these visible lines are called flexure lines. And flexure lines, again, are visible. These are the ones you can see, and they're going to be found near or around joints. So when you bend your fingertips, you can actually see those deep creases. It just allows for your skin to move a little bit more readily over these areas. So these are your flexure lines right here. So you can see how those are the visible ones to the naked eye. Okay. A little bit of why all this matters is going to be stretch marks. When you actually have extreme stretching of the skin and you're having some called dermal tears, you're essentially injuring that deep layers. So that's where stretch marks can come from. And then blisters are where you actually, rather than having your dermal papillae like this, where you've got your epidermis on the top and your dermis on the bottom, what you're actually going to do is you will separate these two and you will create a pocket of inflammation. So you will separate these two layers and it will be formulation or connection of liquid that will then separate the epidermis and the dermis. And that is what you get when you are having a blister. It's the pocket of fluid that's in between the two layers. Okay, so to move on to a couple other topics. 5.4 is going to kind of review back to that method, and we're going to talk about skin coloration. So there's a bunch of different things that can contribute to skin color. We're going to talk about the three primary, what are called pigments, that contribute to skin color. So the first one is going to be melanin. We have already talked about this when we talked about the melanocytes. So this is a little bit of a refresh on that process. Remember, melanin is going to be made by melanocytes. So as it is produced by the melanocytes, it is again shifted to a keratinocyte, and then that keratinocyte is where it will accumulate on the DNA to shield the DNA from the damaging UV sunlight. So wherever there is more sun, there is more need for a protective shield, therefore is the more melanin. So there's two different types or kinds of this pigment, two forms is another way to say that. There's going to be one that is reddish yellow and one that is going to be brownish black. But they both are going to follow the same process with the melanin and transferring over to the keratinocytes. So the difference between the skin coloration is really going to be due to the amount of melanin. So this is important based on thinking of freckles as an example. If freckles are a local accumulation of melanin, if you were to have a lot of freckles in one space, they essentially are going to create a dark spot. So that's where you can kind of see where when you go out into the sun and you accumulate those more freckles and they kind of come together, that's where you'll see the effects of melanin increase because there is more sun, therefore there's more protection is needed. Moles are also local accumulations of melanin. However, we'll talk about in a second what when that goes wrong. Okay, but while this is really cool and we can have this melanin protect our DNA, it does change based on the need for the protective shield. So what happens if you have excessive sun damage? This is going to be what happens when you go through the process of a sunburn or a suntan. You have essentially had excessive sun exposure and you have damaged your skin. So really what you're actually doing is you have created this process on hyperdrive. And as you're doing this process on hyperdrive, you essentially are creating more melanin. And you're going through this entire essentially sun exposure is going to not only just accumulate more melanin, but it's going to cause a couple other processes to occur. So remember, everything we've talked about, it will cause the elastic fibers in your dermal layer to clump. So no one wants that because that will actually produce the leathery skin look for people who've had excessive time in the sun. But what's happened is it's the elastic fibers in the dermal layer that are going to be clumping together. It will also depress the immune system if there's excessive sun exposure. And what it will the biggest thing is it will actually alter the DNA of the skin cells. The more you're out in the sun, the more you have chances of having the DNA of your skin cells altered. And as we know about DNA, it's a protein. If you denature the protein, you have changed the function. So another thing that also happens with this is that UV will actually destroy whatever the body has when it comes to folic acid. And folic acid is really, really important because this is needed for DNA synthesis. So not only do you have the ability to damage your DNA, you can damage the process of making new DNA by removing the folic acid from the system. So all of that can happen just because you're going outside in excessive amounts to the sun. But not only can you have all of these physiological processes happen, is you can just have a reaction to the sun. So you can have this occur if you're taking drugs, perfumes, some essential oils will do this if they're on the skin, antibiotics. You can actually have a reaction because you have a photosensitivity to a chemical. So that's one pigment is going to be the melanin. The second pigment is going to be keratin. Keratin is a fun pigment. It's a yellow to orange pigment. And this pigment is, while it is yellow to orange, you get it from accumulating from certain types of plant products. So as it comes from certain plant products in our diet, what it will do is it will accumulate specifically in the stratum corneum. So the top layer, where there is where it's the thickest layer of the cells. And this color is going to be the most obvious on thick skin, which is going to be the palms and the soles of your feet. So this yellow to orange pigment that accumulates in the stratum corneum for your thick skin it's also going to accumulate in your hypodermis, which is underneath your dermal layer. But what's really cool about this is that this keratin is also found in plants, but it's found in a certain plant product. And the plant product it is found in is going to be carrots. So when they say to eat carrots because it's good for your eyes or you're good for your skin, It's actually very true because keratin is found in plant products and it is going to be converted to vitamin A. Vitamin A is important for vision and eye health. So if you have keratin and it's converted into vitamin A, essentially if you eat carrots, it does help your eyes. So that's where that old wives' tale comes from. But if you eat too many carrots, if you have too much keratin, you will get this yellow to orange pigment, which means you can actually adjust your skin color by having too much accumulation, and your skin can actually take on a reddish or an orangish hue. So another thing that will affect your skin color is going to be hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is going to affect skin color because it is the color of your red blood cells and is going to be more obvious or more apparent when there is less melanin. So the less dark pigment there is, the more obvious that red blood cell will be able to come through. So the pinkish hue of fair skin is really due to the low levels of melanin, but it's mainly because the color of the hemoglobin will actually show through. So it's kind of a twofold process with not only as you're getting the red color from the red blood cells and the hemoglobin, but it's due to the fact that there's not a darker pigment, that there's less melanin in that area. So the dermal capillaries are going to be carrying lots of blood throughout your skin cells, and that's where that red blood cells is going to be found. So it's really important to know all of these things because this is a very important slide to know, is whenever you have changes in skin color, it can actually attest to the homeostasis of the body. So the more changes you see in your skin color, the more things that you could say are wrong, or you could track down things that need to be fixed. But changes in your skin color attest to your level of homeostasis. So we're going to go through these. When you have cyanosis, it means that you are going to have a blue skin color. This is due to low levels of oxygen. So cyanosis, your skin color could actually be bluish. So that's one change to skin color, as your skin becomes blue. Another one that could happen is a change called pallor, where it's going to have a blanching or pale color. This is when you go kind of, when they say you go white as a sheet, or white as a sheet. This is you've blanched. Your pallor has changed. This usually indicates anemia, low blood pressure, fear, and anger. So these are really, really important. If you have this whitish coloration to your skin color, anemia, blood pressure, but also the emotions of fear and anger could be the problem. Erythema or redness. So you can have a change with your skin color that is going more red. What is occurring here is sickness or an immune response. There's fever and hypertension. There could also be inflammation or some sort of allergen response. And then another color you can have is going to be what's called jaundice, which is a yellow color. Jaundice is usually indicated with liver. So if you've ever had someone who gave birth to a baby and they had to put them under the glow lights after birth, it's usually to impact this liver condition or liver concern, and it was discovered because there was a yellow cast to either the skin or the eyes of the infant. So changes in the skin color can actually attest to homeostasis, and that's a really cool process. Some other things that can happen are going to be issues that are more so due to an injury of some kind. So you could have a bruise, which goes as a black and blue. So essentially, this is going to be where you have damaged a blood cell and there's clotted blood beneath the skin. And then the color of the bruise will change based on that clot getting broken down and reabsorbed. You can also have necklaces of this blue or black or brown kind of coloration, and this may be a sign of issues with your insulin and glucose levels. So there's a lot of different colors your skin can change: blue, white, red, yellow. That's what this one is. Or black. All of these can attest to something going wrong. So it's a great example of how you can use something quick to look at the naked eye to be able to attest to changes in the homeostatic level of the body. I will not be spending time covering hair. So if you guys are following along with me, congratulations. Feel free to read through hair on your own. But I find that with this chapter, it is not a primary focus. So we will not be covering hair, but feel free to read through it on your own, especially when it comes to baldness. It's very interesting. And I will also not be covering nails, but feel free to read through those on your own. So we're going to move on to 5.7 and talk about sweat glands. So we have already briefly talked about this in previous chapters when we talked about our glands in chapter 4. So we're going to talk about a couple different types of sweat glands. All skin surface except for specific areas, which are going to be nipples and external genitalia, will have sweat glands. So there is a ton if you think about the entire surface area of the skin. There's going to be two main types: your eccrine, which are also called merocrine, or your apocrine sweat glands. So these two main types are what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about eccrine first. So there's two types of sweat glands. First type is going to be the eccrine or the merocrine sweat glands. This is the most numerous. These are going to be abundant. They're going to be found palms of your head, palms of your hands, soles of your feet, and your forehead. These are important because any of these ducts, remember we're talking about a gland, any of these ducts connect to a pore. So if this is the surface of my skin, essentially there's going to be a duct and the gland will actually be found at the bottom. So this will be on the external. This is your pore. So this is your eccrine or merocrine gland. The product of this, the secretion product, is going to be sweat. So with an eccrine, this is what you think about when you think about a gland. This is exactly what that is. So it's going to be made up of mainly water. It's going to get salts, some vitamins, and some metabolic waste. So this is going to be important because it's when you think of sweat, this is essentially what is happening. But the primary thing here with the secretion of this sweat is that it is going to be made up of 99% water with a couple other things. So that's interesting. It's also going to be acidic. The pH of sweat will range from 4 to 6. So it's going to be on the acidic side. And this is going to be regulated through the sympathetic nervous system from the autonomic nervous system, if you're familiar with branches. And the goal of this is to really help us from overheating, which we know that from first chapter with the negative feedback cycle. So this is what you actually think of when you think of a sweat gland. Here you go. The second type is going to be a little bit different. This is an apocrine sweat gland. And these are going to be found in only a few places. So there's only going to be about 2,000 of these. And they're only really going to be located in the axillary, which is your armpit, plus your anogenital region. So that means these types of sweat glands are going to not be really produced based on overheating and the need to expel heat. These are going to be a little bit deeper. They're deeper into the dermis. They are larger sweat glands, and they're going to have kind of a different product as well. So what they're actually going to do is they will actually secrete a product as well, because that is the definition of a sweat gland. They secrete a product, but it is going to be milky, kind of yellowish. And this is going to be due to a lot of fatty substance in these products. And what's happening here is this milky or this yellowish fatty substance is actually going to include both fatty and proteins, and these is going to be responsible for breaking down sweat. So it's actually going to break down the other product. So this secretion is odorless at first, but as the bacteria is activated, as this bacteria starts breaking down the sweat, it will actually cause an odor. So an apocrine sweat gland is essentially body odor. It's different than just straight sweating. It's happening because you secrete the product that's kind of milky or yellowish. It's a fatty substance, and it's odorless, but the bacteria will start to break down your sweat and other substances on your surface of your skin, and when that happens, it will lead to body odor. So this is the apocrine sweat glands are usually going to show up and begin functioning at puberty, which is where you're going to kind of have body odor appearing. We don't really know why. It may act as a sexual scent gland as well, but this is going to be functioning more so at a certain point in development, whereas your merocrine or your eccrine glands are going to be happening essentially all throughout the lifespan. So then this is the apocrine, which is going to be the body odor. You also do have two types of modified sweat glands or modified apocrine glands. The first type is going to be the ceremonious, and this is going to be where you are going to have essentially your earwax. So these are going to be found in your ear canal, and they were going to secrete cererum, which is going to be your earwax. But then you also have your mammary glands. This is another type of modified apocrine gland, and these are going to produce the product milk. So these two specialized modified types of apocrine glands you do need to know. Okay, so those are your sweat glands. What is happening with your sebaceous or your oil glands? So sebaceous or your oil glands. So these are also going to be widely distributed, but these are not found on your thick skin, which is going to be your palms and the soles of your feet. So this is a little bit opposite from the other ones. So this is why you don't produce oil on your hands or your feet. So this is typically going to be developed from hair follicles and then secreted into hair follicles. So if you think about oily hair, this is kind of the process of what's happening there. So it's going to develop in the hair follicles and then get secreted into that follicle. This is also going to be typically activated around puberty, maybe stimulated by hormones, which may have an increase in oil, but we really don't know. But for this, the product is going to be called sebum. And sebum is a oily holocrine secretion. It's got bacterial properties and it's going to soften skin. So that will be responsible for lubricating the hair and skin, but sebum will be the product of a sebaceous oil gland. Okay, so you can see this image again where we've got the sebaceous, eccrine, and then the sweat pore. So you can see how all those work together. A summary of them all. And then what is happening when you've got a whitehead or just a pimple, what's happening when you have a blackhead, and then this is a really cool example of what's happening when you have cradle cap, and this is essentially going to be hyperactive sebaceous oil gland. You get this cradle cap on infants and in a newborn. Okay, so there's two last sections to this chapter, and we're going to run through 5.8. This is a little bit common sense, so they put it at the end of the chapter. So every every system that we're going to talk about, so this is the integumentary system, every system will talk not only about all the pieces, all the cells, the overall structure of it, but we'll also talk about the function of every system. So what are the functions of skin? These are kind of common, self-explanatory based on everything that we've talked about. So the first part is that skin is a barrier. That is the important thing. But the other functions it includes is going to be protection, essentially keeping the outside out and the inside in, regulating your body's temperature, which we know from the negative feedback cycle in the first part of the course. Sensations, this is going to be the ability to pick up nerve sensations or touch is going to be one. Metabolic functions, so for example, this metabolic function, we're going to talk about that. Blood reservoir, your dermal layer will actually hold a lot of blood. And then this is where you're actually going to be able to get rid of a lot of wastes. So when we're talking about protection, your skin is exposed to a lot of different things, including microorganisms, abrasions, cuts, changes in temperature, i.e. Georgia this week, and harmful chemicals. But there's three types of barriers that we talked about at the beginning. When we're talking about chemical barriers, we're talking about the fact that there are chemicals on your skin. So when we have chemicals that are going to be on the skin, what we're talking about is sweat, which has antimicrobial properties. We're talking about sebum. We're talking about something called defensins, which are also found on your skin. But you're also going to have an acid maintenance, and you're going to have essentially a low pH of your skin. So it's got an acidity to it. And then also, we talked a lot about the melanin, that protection of the DNA. That is technically considered a chemical. So melanin would fall into this category as well. When we're talking about physical protection is the actual skin cells themselves. So those are all going to be a physical protection. The outside layer is going to be made up of the flat, dead, keratinized cells of the stratum corneum. That helps maintain that physical boundary. And then there are only some things that have a limited penetration to the skin. So there are some things that will actually have the ability to penetrate through all of this protective physical barrier. So some examples are going to be lipid-soluble substances. Poison ivy is an example of a plant oleracin, or organic solvents, which is why you're supposed to be wearing gloves when you deal with things like paint thinner or acetone. Heavy metal, lead or mercury, can get absorbed through the skin very easily. Some drugs can get absorbed through the skin. This is also why gloves are a personal protection equipment in clinical settings. But then there's also some drug agents where you can actually quickly absorb drugs through the skin, so they're applied to the skin. So that's what's happening with the physical protection. But when we're talking about the biological barrier, we are talking about the skin cells themselves, in the sense of we've got our phagocytotic cells, and these are going to be cells that are our dendritic cells that are going to essentially destroy any invaders that are going to come up on the surface of the skin. You're also going to have macrophages that will be able to protect against foreign antigens and also instigate an immune response. So these biological barrier is going to be essentially cells that will instigate or destroy some sort of immune response. So we have lots of different types of protection with our skin. Here's some examples of how you can actually absorb some substances through your skin and some things that can come down. So the next function was body temperature regulation. So we talked a lot about this already and at different points throughout the course. So your skin has the ability to regulate your body's overall temperature. So you have two types of ways you will do this. One is called insensible perspiration. Insensible perspiration is going to be normal sweat glands where you are producing unnoticeable sweat. So this is going to be a type of sweat that is going to be called like insensible perspiration. It is, you're not aware of it, so it's unnoticeable, and it is just going to be normal resting temperature control. So this is, you are not doing anything crazy. You are not in an extremely cold and hot environment. This is insensible perspiration is just kind of happening every day. This is when you get to the end of the day and you just kind of feel, for lack of a better word, gross. It's just this insensible perspiration. But what you also have is something called sensible perspiration. Insensible perspiration is actual sweating to cool down. So this is when you actually go to the gym, go for a run, and you are activating lots of parts of your body. You're going to have dilation of your dermal vessels. You're going to have your body temperature rise because the heat has increased. Whatever the cause is happening, you are essentially trying to cool the body down. This is sweating for that effect called sensible perspiration. So there's actually two types of sweating in order to control our body temperature. Another function of the skin is going to be cutaneous sensation. And again, this just means that in our dermal layer, you will actually have connections to your nervous system. So this is where we're going to find what are called exteroreceptors, which are responding outside of the body. And you're going to have things called free nerve endings. We're going to review all of these again when we get later in the course, but all you need to know really for right now is that the sensation means that there is going to be connections to your sensory nerve fibers and your nerve endings for you to be able to feel and process what's happening in your skin and what's happening in the external environment. Okay, so what's happening with your metabolic functions? So like we talked about with skin coloration, is that you need keratin in order to produce vitamin D. So the fact that you produce vitamin D in your skin means that this is going to be a metabolic function. So your skin is really important. It needs that keratin, but it's going to actually produce the vitamin D and cause that chemical reaction to occur in the skin. So that's an example of some metabolic functions that are happening in your skin's, your epidermal and your dermal layer. Another function was going to be a blood reservoir. So this just means that your skin can actually hold up to 5% of the body's total blood volume. So you can store blood in your skin, in your dermal layer, the capillaries in your dermal layer. So what you can actually do is once you've done that, you can constrict and have the blood routed from your from your integumentary system, from your dermal layer, and have it shunted to other organs if you need it, such as exercising or taking an exam. So you can actually control where the blood is going, but a lot of it can be stored in your dermal layer. And then the last function is going to be excretion. So this is going to be the production and release of a product. Sorry, that's secretion. This is going to be the release of waste material. This is where we're getting rid of production, byproducts of producing other things, cell metabolites. This is going to be our waste material. This is going to be primarily made of nitrogen waste. Nitrogen waste is going to be ammonia, urea, and uric acid. These are all things that we want to get rid of, but our body will produce as byproducts, so we can excrete through our skin, and we can do it through sweating as well. Okay, so that was the overall functions of skin. The last thing we're going to talk about is going to be what happens when our skin goes wrong. So we're going to start with this section, and we're going to go through both skin cancer and we're going to go through burns. So 2 ways that things can go wrong within your skin in your integumentary system. So there's a ton of different conditions and ailments. There's over 1,000 different things that we know that can go wrong, but a lot of internal diseases reveal themselves through your skin. Like we said, it can attest to your homeostatic state. If it's on the skin, some of them are actually infectious, but some of them are not infectious but are very, very damaging, and we're going to talk through skin cancer and we're going to talk through burns. So when you're looking at skin cancer, the primary thing you're looking here is going to be tumors that are found on or near the skin. So 2 terms you need to know. When you hear the term benign, when it comes to cancer, if a tumor is considered benign, it is not actively growing. If it is not actively growing, it is considered not cancerous. So it is a tumor, let's do that to be, but it is not cancerous. Or you can have one that is metastasized, and that means it is actively growing, and not only has it actively growing, but it has spread to other parts of the body than where it was originally found. This is described as highly, this is cancer. So benign and metastasized are the 2 terms that you'll kind of need to know. What can actually increase your risk to your skin cancer are going to be overexposure to the UV and irritation of your skin on a frequent basis. So doing a lot of things to disrupt your natural protection of your skin. So there are 3 major types of skin cancer, and these are the 3 we're going to talk about. The first type of skin cancer, we're also going to talk about how to identify it. So the first type of skin cancer is going to be basal cell carcinoma. Carcinoma means essentially cancer, but look at the name of this, basal cell. So this is actually going to occur in cells in the stratum basale layer, because that's basal cell carcinoma. So in the stratum basale layer, this is what's going to happen. What they're actually going to do is they're going to proliferate. They're going to produce way, 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 way too much. And they will essentially, instead of just going up, they will invade down. And they will invade into the dermis and the hypodermis. So on your stratum basale, your keratinocytes were actually producing 2 daughter cells a lot of the time. One, if this is going to be my epidermis and my dermis, I'm going to have 1 daughter cell stay down here on this stratum basale layer, and 1 daughter cell move up and go through the other layers. What we're saying with this basal cell carcinoma is that this is going to go down, and we're going to accumulate down here in an area that we're not supposed to be. The good news about this is easily cured just by cutting out the area of overgrowth. So surgical excision, they can essentially just cut out the whole thing. And that's what happens in about 99.9% of the cases. So you can see right here that they'll just go through and cut that out. The second type of skin cancer is going to be squamous cell carcinoma. So squamous cell carcinoma, now that we know about our types of cells and our types of tissues, this essentially is going to be the second most common type of skin cell, or second most common type of skin cancer. And what it can actually do is easily metastasize. So it can easily grow. So what's happening with squamous cell carcinoma is it is going to be primarily keratinocytes of the stratum spinosum layer. Those are the ones that are producing and overgrowing. And this is going to appear a little bit different. It's going to appear as a red scaly papule, and it's found scalp, ears, lower lip, and hands is the primary area. And the good news is you can do the same thing. You can just remove this surgically, and it's got a very high survival rate. So, but it can grow rapidly if not removed. And then the third type of skin cancer is the most dangerous, melanoma. So now that we have learned all about some melanin, this is where melanoma comes in. So this is actually cancer or overgrowth of your melanocytes. This will actually produce too much melanin. So what's going on with this is highly metastatic. So it is highly reproductive, and it will overgrow very quickly, and it will travel to other places, and it will spread. So it is highly metastatic. And this is usually going to be done by excision. They will cut it out, but it's also usually accompanied with some sort of immunotherapy or radiation by pill or that kind of thing. So with melanoma, because the most dangerous of the cancers, of the skin cancers, there's a good rule of thumb to be able to identify things that are considered melanoma. And this is called the ABCD rule. So what's happening with the ABCD rule, it's the key to early survival. So A, what we're talking about when you see A, it's asymmetry. Are the two sides of the pigment consistent, or does the pigment match all over? Or is there an asymmetry to the actual pigment itself? Remember, we're talking about melanocytes, melanoma, so it's a dark tumor. So B is going to be border irregularity. And this means the borders are uneven. So what is the shape of it? If it is going to be perfectly round, much better. But if it is in a shape where the borders are uneven, this is going to be very, very dangerous. Okay, border irregularity. C is going to stand for color. If it contains a lot of different colors, or it contains several colors, that is not a good sign. Having it be one consistent shade is much better. Still needs to be excised, but it's a good rule of thumb. And then diameter, how large the actual space is. So if it is larger than 6 millimeters, it is considered something to probably be melanoma. So if it is larger than 6 millimeters, not 66, 6 millimeters, this is going to be dangerous. This is 6 millimeters, to put it into perspective, is about the size of a pencil eraser. So that's about the size of something that is considered keep an eye on. But for the ABCD rule to recognizing melanoma, that is where you can, the diameter of anything larger than 6 millimeters is something of concern. So that was skin cancer. We're going to briefly switch gears to burns. So burns are going to be when you actually are going to have tissue damage. So a burn is by definition tissue damage inflicted by a couple different things. It can be inflicted by intense heat, like a fire. That's the most common one. It can be inflicted by electricity. So if you got struck by lightning, that would be an electrical burn. It can be inflicted by radiation. And it can be inflicted by certain chemicals, a chemical burn. But a burn is tissue damage that is inflicted by something. And what's going to happen is it's going to denature the protein. Here we go. If it denatures the protein, it will actually destroy the cells. That's not what you want to happen. So burns are very, very dangerous. What's going to happen when we're talking about burns in the concept of our skin is that it takes off the external layer of our skin, so it's going to result in dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. And the ultimate thing that this can lead to is renal shutdown and circulatory shock. Basically because you have removed the entire protective layer, depending on how thick the burn, deep the burn goes and how much tissue is destroyed. If you've lost some or all of that protective layer, it will lead to loss of water, challenges with your electrolytes, your liver, and your kidneys will have issues, and your circulatory system and your cardiovascular process and your blood vessels will have issues. So it's very, very, very important. So just like we have the ABCD rule of melanoma, burns have the rule of nines. So the rule of nines is how you evaluate burns. So basically, it's going to be 99% of your body is broken down into sections. So your body is going to be broken down into 11 sections. Each section is going to be 9% of the surface of your body. So looking at, it takes 99% of your body, breaks it down into 11 different sections, and each of those sections covers 9% of your body's surface. What they're excluding is the 1% for your genitals. And this is used to estimate volume of fluid loss. So the more damage to the more surface area, the more fluid you have lost. And the rule of nines is going to be really important with seeing how deep and how severe the burn is. So burns are classified by severity, as I'm sure we all are aware of, first, second, and third degree burns. So we're going to talk through the criteria of classifying burns. First degree burn. What's happening with a first degree burn is that it's going to be only the epidermis layer. Your dermal layer is still intact. The symptoms for this are not going to be very severe. They're just going to be more uncomfortable. So it's going to be redness, but just localized to the area. It'll be swelling, and it'll be pain. Think about a sunburn. A sunburn is an example of a first degree burn, but these will also heal in 2 to 3 days. They're uncomfortable. It's only the epidermis. You just have red, swelling, and some pain. That's a first degree burn. When you have a second degree burn, it's going to be a little bit more severe. This is going to be your epidermis, the entire epidermis, and your upper dermal layer. So it's going to take off part of your dermis. The symptoms are going to be this exact same as at first degree. The only exception is it is going to add the presence of blisters. So the moment you actually see a blister pop up, you have immediately moved into a second degree burn. With this, you can have skin regeneration. You'll have to create, reproduce, resynthesize that dermal and epidermal layer, but it will actually occur usually within 3 to 4 weeks. Not crazy long, but way longer than 2 to 3 days. But the big difference here between first and second is going to be the presence of a blister. And then when you have third-degree burns, a third-degree burn is the most severe burn that you can have. This so-called full thickness burn, which basically means that you have burned through the entire epidermis plus dermis. It is the entire thickness of the skin. You have burned off the entire external protective layer. With this is happening, your symptoms, it's not going to be red. Because remember, your blood vessels are going to be found in your dermal layer. You have just gotten rid of your entire dermal layer. So you are past that. So you're not going to be red. What will happen with this one is the skin will turn white, or it could turn gray. It could turn cherry red, which is beyond where you're almost down to the, not blood vessels, but you're almost down to seeing the actual muscle itself, or blackened, like legit actually burned. So that's the color of the skin that you will actually see. But what's also different with this one is symptoms. There will be no pain. There will absolutely be no pain on part of the patient. Mainly because, again, you've burned off the epidermis and the dermal layer. The dermis is where you will find your nerve supply. You have burned off all of the nerve endings. They have all been destroyed. Therefore, there is actually no pain. To heal with this, you are actually going to need skin grafting. They will have to recreate your skin by moving it from one area of your body or from a different animal or different animal to your wherever it needs to be. So these are graphic pictures, but first degree burn, second degree burn based on the presence of a blister. It's red, it's inflamed, but it's localized. Whereas when you've got the third degree burn, it is a full thickness burn. That red color is because you're all the way through and you're looking at the muscle below. There is no pain with this one, but again, it would require skin grafting to cover that up. So with our burns and its severity, burns are considered critical based on these criteria. So burns are critical. Burns are critical if there is 25% or less of the body is going to be in a second degree burn. So that means you have blisters on 25% or less of your body. It's critical, or 25% or more, 25% of your body is going to have a second degree burn in a blister. That is critical. 10% of your body is in third degree burn, which means you are critical. And if there are third degree burns on areas of face, hands, and feet, that is when it is also considered critical. So if 25% of my body is in second degree burns, 10% of my body is in third degree burn, or 3% of my body, or I've got third degree burns on my face, hands, and feet, this is where the rule of nines and the severity of my burns come into play. So if we said 10% of my body was in a third degree burn, 10%, that means it could be this one leg and part of my torso. That would be 9% plus a couple percent over there. You could have a burn right here and it not actually be part of your internal integral organs, not touch your respiration, not touch your cardiovascular, but it would still be considered severe because that would be 10% of your body in a third degree burn. So this is where you can see the rule of nines and the percentage really comes into play. So when you're looking at this, you can see that each arm is 4.5, so the arms together are 9%, whereas each leg is considered 9%. The face is 4.5, and you can see the Anterior trunk is 8%, and the posterior trunk is 18, so together they are 36. So you can see how this whole thing will come together. And we are not going to be covering the developmental aspects of this right now either. So that is it for chapter 5. It is one of the easier chapters, really focusing on the different types of skin cells that we have, the layers in the epidermis, the layers in the dermis, how all of those work together, your oil glands, your sweat glands, and then diving into skin coloration and homeostatic changes, and then looking at some ways that you can have clinical implications with your skin for burns and for cancer. So that would be chapter 5.